In light of those investigations and the incidents being reported around the country, we wanted to bring in Kent Lee, the co-chair of the San Diego Asian Pacific Islander Coalition. And I know Kent recently wrote an op-ed in the Union Tribune outlining this trend and some of the things San Diego's Asian Pacific Islander community has been facing during this pandemic. First of all, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. We want to ask you, why do you think we are hearing about more attacks now?
Yeah, this has unfortunately been a trend. I think we saw quite a number of attacks initially being reported at the start of the pandemic. And some of that does have to do with the language and rhetoric that was being used to describe the virus. And I think what we're seeing is sort of this resurgence of that recently. And even though we are hearing of some of these reports, I think what's more concerning is that for each one of them that we do see, we know that there's got to be dozens, if not hundreds of others that have not been reported and not shared.
And what is the coalition doing to address some of these problems? And how do you get people to step forward so you have a better sense of just how widespread this is?
Yeah, so the coalition really formed organically this last year. The API community within San Diego is, quite fragmented in the sense that it represents so many different backgrounds, cultures, languages. And so much of it is really about getting people to communicate together, making sure that people are aware that there are resources and tools in terms of reporting any incidents that they see, looking to find, communities that we can connect with in terms of responding to the crisis sort of together. And also just recognizing that when it comes to acts of racism, and even xenophobia, they're not unique just to Asian Pacific Islander communities. I think we've seen, examples of where those have really been at the forefront amongst communities all throughout, not just San Diego, but around the country.
As you know, two well-known Asian American actors recently offered a reward for information leading to arrest after a 91-year-old man was attacked in Northern California, and police did make an arrest. Do you think there needs to be more attention brought in that way, that people with high profiles need to make sure people out there understand what's happening?
I mean, it certainly helps that when people who have the profile are able to speak on it, but I mean, let's be frank, it shouldn't require any celebrities to have to call attention to the issue. I think, from a community perspective, we should be keeping our eye out for these. We should be collecting data to understand how deep the impact might be. And when we see an incident, both acting at that moment, but also encouraging those who are subject to any kind of act of hate to actually report it so that, people are aware. And I think there are many cases where people shrug off incidents like this. They think that it's, maybe not up to the level at which it requires attention. But the reality is that without any kind of reporting, it tends to go under the radar.
You talked about what the coalition has been trying to do. What can everyone do better?
Yeah, so I think we've asked, in my op-ed, I suggested three things that people really could do. The first one really is just acting when you see an act of hate. Speaking up and making sure to call it out. Don't just be a silent bystander. The second is really just encouraging that people report any incidents that they see or hear about. We've seen on community forums in places like Nextdoor that there have been people who have experienced an act of hate and they have not had a chance to report it, or even if they have tried to report it, maybe gotten some pushback, and knowing that they really do need to make sure that their voice is heard. And then finally, finding a way to support communities who are being impacted by this. I think during the pandemic, we've seen within the Asian Pacific Islander community that many businesses and others have been impacted doubly, both by the actual pandemic itself, but also, through the stereotyping and profiling that they've seen being businesses that are Asian Pacific Islander operated.
Well, Kent Lee, thank you so much for all that information and for helping raise awareness.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing a light to this issue as well.
It's very important.